Hello students. As students of political science and history, you know that the state is always the focal point of political thinking. And political thinkers and scholars since earliest times have tried to respond to this institution, which is the basic forum within which political activity unfolds. So let us take a look at the state in the time of the Delhi Sultanate. What was the political structure of the state? Dynastic monarchy was a structure with which Indians had long been familiar. From 1210, that is the time when the Delhi Sultanate was formally inaugurated, the sultans gathered more and more powers. It can be fairly stated that a sultan was generally a more powerful ruler than a Hindu ruler of the earlier centuries. The process reached its climax under Alauddin Khilji, who effectively controlled the empire and ran it as if it were a village. Bin Tughlaq also went far in this direction, but of course he suffered setbacks. You will be reminded of Napoleon, who once said that I am the state, and that is the kind of feeling you get when you try to understand the state in the context of the Sultanate period. The king is the focal point of the state and the entire Sultanate, and it is on his shoulders that the peace, order and stability of the realm and the welfare and economic prosperity of the people depend. While it is important for a king to have a noble character and a virtuous disposition, it is vital for him to carry out his responsibilities in a systematic way and on the basis of sound principles which have been pragmatically arrived at. One of the most eloquent exponents of medieval political thinking, particularly with reference to the Sultanate, is to be found in the works of Ziauddin Barani. His writings offer a wealth of information about the Sultanate and the politics of the sultans of Delhi. Alongside elaborate historical accounts of the period, Barani throws light on the political problems, including implementation of Islamic laws in the newly established Muslim state in India. But this is basically a historical treatise and not a political treatise when you look at the Tarikh-e Firoz Shahi, which was basically written keeping in mind Firoz Shah Tughlaq. His Fatawa-e Jahandari, in which he advises the sultans and the kings, as almost Machiavelli did for his prince and in his prince, we find that this is a much more celebrated political treatise where Barani speaks through the mouth of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, whom he idealized as a ruler, as to how an effective system of government should be established through the implementation of the Islamic Shariat. The government expresses the will of the state. The state as a concrete reality, as you all know, is most clearly manifested in its government, which is the most tangible organ of the state. In both Islamic and Indian conceptions of government, the king was assisted in his duties by ministers or counselors. The ministers were of course subservient to the king, whose authority derived both from the king himself and from custom and tradition. As more centralized forms of administration were put into place, especially from the 13th century onwards, it became much more structured. When one considers the administrative system, one is able to understand the functioning of the state through the institution that was most visibly organized, that is the government, which manifested itself in the administrative hierarchy, in which you will see the wazir is the most important official. The wazir ut tanfiz was officially an assistant of the ruler, for it was his responsibility to carry out the king's orders. He too was fairly powerful by virtue of his position as head of the administration. The final form of all instructions issued by the king was ultimately drawn up under the supervision of the wazir. His responsibilities included trying to make the country prosperous through recommending appointment of officials and to supervise the organization and command of the army. He was also a finance minister who was in charge of all accounts and businesses of the state. The Sultan was assisted by an entire body of ministers who managed their respective departments under royal orders, almost like a cabinet. The most important departments were those of religion, justice, army, intelligence service, the imperial post, and of course finance and revenue. For administrative purposes, we find the Sultanate was divided into provinces. Central administration was only a part of the system of administration, for the empire was divided into provinces, and that was necessary for purposes of efficient administration. The executive head of each province was a governor. His powers were considerable, yet limited by the central government, especially in financial matters. In fact, Muslim political authority had from the very beginning accepted the idea of governors and divided them into two kinds, those with limited authority and those with unlimited authority. The second had a subdivision of unlimited authority acquired as a result of rebellion. All kinds could be seen during the Sultanate, for there were governors appointed by the Sultan, some were tributary chiefs, and later, of course, there were rulers in places like Bengal. When the government of Delhi was weak, the governors, especially those of the distant provinces, tended to assume more powers and to run their provinces autonomously. That would be natural. Some were tempted to declare independence, but depending upon the circumstances, a rebel governor might face the gallows or become the founder of a new provincial dynasty. So it all depended ultimately on the kind of surveillance and control that the Sultan was able to exercise over the entire administrative setup of the country. The Sultan was therefore the apex of the central government, who worked with imperial diwans. There were four such diwans: Diwani Wizarat, Diwani Arz, Diwani Insha, and Diwani Risalat, which served as the pillars of the central government. The Delhi Sultanate was divided into smaller units called Wilayat or Iklim or Iqtas. The number of Iqtas changed. For instance, under Alauddin Khilji, there were 12 Iqtas. So what was the Iqta system? Administration was necessary not so much as a function of the state, but rather as a method of collection of finances which could then be distributed. The Iqta has been called a military assignment, that is, grant of land not yet conquered, which was handed over to a noble or conqueror, and then establish an administrative system for the collection of taxes. This does not seem to have been the pattern in the early years of the Sultanate, but later it became much more an assignment of revenue equivalent to pay for military and administrative duties. Land in the kingdom was divided into the Khalisa and Iqta, the former being land, the income of which went to the king directly, while the latter was land, the revenue of which could be assigned. The state therefore survived by revenue, but it definitely lived on force. Each Iqta was under a wali, mukti or naib, and was divided into shiks under a shikdar. Each shik was further divided into pargana under an alim, and then further into a village under khuts and mukaddams. As financial gain and status would benefit only one section of society, the king would also have to introduce strict economic policies, particularly in respect of maintenance of prices, for this was important for ensuring the support of the soldiers. Now, why is the army so important? I just mentioned that the state survives as a result of revenue, but it basically is founded on force. Barani emphasized force as an integral part of the state. Given the time, force was to be asserted with the help of the army, and therefore the soldiers had to be kept happy in order to make sure that the army continued to function with reasonable efficiency. When one delves into the political history of northern India, in medieval times one notes that after the Mauryas, the Sultanate was the largest and the most powerful state in India. This obviously could not have been attained unless there was sound administration and the revenue collection was also adequate. Barani has clarified that the basis of the Sultan's power and prestige was force or coercive strength that was rooted in the army. And that is why military organization of the Sultanate was a very important part of the state that we see in medieval India. Iltutmish, a Turkish ruler, had thought of organizing the army of the Sultanate as the king's army, which is centrally recruited and centrally paid. What he organized was called Ikta army. However, usually army ranks would be disbanded as soon as the campaigns were over. Balban increased the number of the soldiers in the army. It was Alauddin Khilji who took more interest in the army than any other sultan did. He was the first sultan to set a permanent standing army of the Delhi Sultanate. He did not disband the soldiers after the campaign was over, and he recruited directly and paid them in cash from the public treasury. The same policy was followed by Ghiazuddin Tughlaq, but Firoz Shah adopted granting hereditary assignments of land to the soldiers. This particular decision actually ruined the army's position. During Lodi regime, too much emphasis was on tribal traditions, and the army of the Sultanate was turned into some kind of a tribal militia. Police organization was also important. So as far as police organization is concerned, the head of the police was a Kotwal who was responsible for the maintenance of law and order in the towns. The judicial department was headed by the Qazi ul Qazzat, and the Sultan was the supreme or the highest court of justice, and he sat in a court called Mazalim. So that makes us convinced that it is the Sultan who was ultimately the fulcrum of the Sultanate. Barani observes that without a large, powerful and magnificent army and proper management of its affairs, it would not be possible for any ruler or king to attain any of the following objectives, whether it was preserving the kingship or directing the administration or establishing the prestige and the conquests to the heart of the people and bringing the world under his control, crushing rebels. In all matters great and small, the army had a very important role to play. And that is why the organization of the army also assumes significance. The Diwani Arz or military department was headed by the Arzi Mumalik. The Ariz was, however, not the commander-in-chief of the army. That position belonged to the king. He was the ultimate and the supreme commander, but he was responsible for military administration. He had to inspect troops, recommend assignments, and make military preparations for campaigns. He was also the regular channel of communication with the army. He was also responsible for placement of troops in different parts of the empire. A portion of the troops was stationed permanently in Delhi, consisting mostly of royal slaves and troops directly under royal command. This part of the army was known as Hashmi Kalb. Troops that were stationed in various provinces but not in Delhi were known as Hashmi Atraf. The role of the Ariz was significant when it comes to military administration. Barani observes that the Ariz should be kinder to the soldiers than a mother and a father. He should throw a veil upon the crimes of men. He should punish and put right the soldiers in the same way as a father corrects an undutiful son. Try and understand the spirit. It is important that the army is always kept in good humor and happy so that it delivers whenever called for. He should not resort to extreme cruelties and punishments, and that is why it is very important that the Ariz is humane in his dealings with the personnel of the military. He should be able to discriminate between offences so that loyal and brave soldiers and officers are not deprived of their dignity for every small fault. He should keep the king informed of the crimes and the defects of the army as far as possible and try to prevent the king from inflicting deaths or death penalties or harsh punishments on the army personnel. He should not make the king the enemy of the army or the army the enemy of the king. So what were the constituents of the army? Several main pillars of the army was important during those times. The army had in fact 4 constituents: infantry, cavalry, war elephants and auxiliary. The cavalry was further divided into 3 wings: There were soldiers without horses, soldiers with a single horse, and soldiers with 2 horses. The monarch also maintained personal troops called kalb. The army, apart from performing its basic functions of security and expansion of the state, also acquired importance for another reason. It actuated and acted as a facilitator of the expansion of Islam, since the ruling class of the Sultanate arrived in the scene as invaders and immigrants and were in need of a large support base. And you have also seen that the Islamic state that we find in India was basically a theocracy, okay? And that is why the role of the army in this regard acquires a lot of importance. In contrast to earlier philosophers, Barani did not talk about stability, welfare, or law, none of which seemed to be, in his estimation, anywhere near as omnipresent as violence and force, which are the basic underpinnings of the state. But force is also necessary not just for coercion, but also for the dispensation of justice. A ruler with force and authority is needed to enforce justice among the people. Justice is the basis of the social organization and the civil order, and it is administered by the strong ruler among the people. Through his royal power and prestige, the king can prevent the strong from taking recourse to oppression in their dealings with the people. Justice also prevents tyranny and strengthens the sanctity of religious commands. Without justice, family and property cannot be safely maintained. In fact, if the king is the fulcrum of the entire sultanate, please remember that the key to this position is underlined by the fact that the king is the embodiment of justice, the fountainhead of justice. And that is why justice and the army have such inextricable linkages with the position of the king. Public justice, in fact, is the necessary foundation of kingship. If the quality of justice, which is innate in the kings, is translated into action, then no virtue except the virtue of the prophet can be considered higher than that of the king. But if the king fails to adhere to the principles of justice, then he too, like his subordinate officers, can be overthrown. A sure indication that justice prevails in a kingdom is that calamities and misfortunes do not descend on the kingdom. The principle of moderation is something that is emphasized both by the Shariat and by the demands of pragmatism. So the king, as I mentioned a moment earlier, is the giver of justice. He is the fountainhead of justice, and that is where lies the key to his position. The real justification of the supremacy of the kings and of their power and dignity, Barani had remarked, is the need for enforcing justice. Justice was an essential element of the administration, which to Barani was all-encompassing, from remission of land tax to supply of commodities to buyers at production cost, and from dispensing civil and criminal cases to extending and granting monetary help to the needy from the state treasury. All these are corroborated by justice. In order to avert popular disaffection and discontent, the need for such justice was imperative. Another aspect related with justice and consequently with the security of the state was remission of taxes. At least during calamities, Barani suggested the king should remit and reduce taxes and extend monetary help from the treasury till the time it was possible and necessary. So we also have reference to certain welfare measures on part of the state in the time of the Sultanate. The king ought to retain his hold over the state. He ensures peace and stability in his state and maintains the welfare of the people. Barani's political theory is premised on the notion that the ruler is constantly exposed to attempts to overthrow him. The king must always be mindful of this possibility because people nourish resentment against the ruler and might seek to take revenge. Barani therefore cautions the ruler to be perennially on his guard against deception and conspiracies. He will almost remind you of the kind of warnings that Machiavelli issued to the prince. Wise rulers are therefore surrounded by guards and watchmen so they do not fall prey to rebels and assassins. Barani therefore recommends an elaborate intelligence network involving an intricate system of spies and informants for his rulers, which he must look upon as an essential pillar of his rule and leadership. So alongside other regular pillars of government, the emphasis on an extensive espionage system is not to be overlooked. If information about a planned rebellion reaches the ruler in time, he can crush it in such a way that he will not have to take recourse to murder of the rebels. The state, therefore, unmistakably originates and continues in force. The political theory of Barani clearly reflected the age he lived in. I told you that political thought is always a response to the times, and that is why the structure of the state, the ethos of the state, becomes an important consideration as we dabble in medieval political thought in India. Barani was witness to 3 dynastic changes and multiple assassinations, and the consequent changes in the composition of the nobility. It is therefore not strange that he identifies both the origin and the continuation of states in the time of the Sultanate in violence and force. Any new king had to try to exterminate supporters of an older regime and then dispense favors to his own followers in the hope of retaining his loyalty. Since the king could not take such loyalty for granted, he would need to ensure them through gifts of high positions and financial rewards, keep them under his aegis and retain full control over them. That would be the spirit underlying the message of Barani. But of course, if those gifts and favors do not work, the king will have no choice but to take recourse to violence. Kingship was thus a crucial feature of the state. Kingship was not considered good or bad in itself. It was the qualities of the person on the throne which mattered. Kingship was therefore what the occupant of the throne made of it. While Barani described the king as the representative of God, he also stated that the royalty was based on terror. Force was the true source of royal power. It will remind you of Machiavelli when he says that a wise king must always take pains to be feared rather than be loved, and that is exactly the message which Barani is also transmitting. Force was the true source of royal power, and it was the king's personal nature which could actually provide a restraint on the unlimited use of force. In fact, it was through force that a man got the position of king. For every man on seizing territory declared that he was king of that territory and subsequently acquired all the trappings of kingship like nobles, slaves, etc. Force thus was a prerequisite for the attainment and maintenance of kingship. And what is important, that it is not only something that underlines the kingship, it is also something which the king must display. Another way to maintain his position was by display of his pomp and position, so as to overawe the masses by the sheer display of his magnificence. Barani observed in this context that kings who maintained glory and grandeur of the court by impressing royal people were able to create fear among the subjects, which actually elevated the prestige and the position of the king. So the people revered the king. The kings thus created fear through their display of strength and glory among commoners as well as among nobles. And one of the best examples of such a policy of terror was the one that was followed by Balban. Balban was convinced that the only way to effectively deal with the external and the internal threats was to augment the power and prestige of the Sultan. Sword was the chief weapon of Balban to achieve his objectives. In other words, force or coercion became the mainstay of Balban's position and strength, which he used unhesitatingly and uncompromisingly against whoever dared to defy the authority of the Sultan. So the Sultan, through his acts of violence, would also offer a demonstration effect to the people who would generally be wary of any act of rebellion. So that would be a very clear message to his rivals, rebels, all robbers, thieves, invaders and lawbreakers. By following such a stern policy, Balban wanted to strike terror in the minds of the people that whosoever dared to challenge the authority of the Sultan will not be spared. And that is not a message that is likely to be lost easily among the people. So what was Barani's advice to the king? Barani advised the Sultan to achieve the objectives of Islam and cultivate the attributes of terror, prestige, pride, high status, domination and superiority. He must have a keen sense of timing and the presence of mind to act and react at the opportune moment, when to use violence most judiciously. He points out every merit and demerit of the king will be adopted by the subjects. The elect among the subjects will try to cultivate every virtue the king possesses, whether he orders them to do so or not. And the king's vices also have a very similar effect. Thus, if the king is given to religious devotions, all the distinguished men of the country will strive for devotion and piety. So what would be the concluding observations about the state in the time of the Delhi Sultanate? In theory, the Muslim state was a theocracy. That is, the head of the state was also the religious head, and he was looked upon as the representative of God on earth, and therefore derived his position and authority from God. Thus, the Caliph was the supreme head of the whole Muslim world. Although the Sultans of Delhi professed formal allegiance to the Caliphate, the Sultanate was always independent of the state for all practical purposes. In the ultimate analysis, the state in the Delhi Sultanate was not a matter of cooperation, but of force. We have made reference to that recurrently. For it was force that both established and maintained the state. In the best of times and in the worst of times, force could not be forsaken. So force was the true source of royal power and the basis of the state, and the unlimited use of force could be restrained not by any legal check but by a moral imperative, that of the king. Thank you.